Twin sisters vanished during a snowstorm, and 20 years later, their names carved into the wooden beams of a sealed cabin attic would unravel a mystery that had haunted 3 generations of the small mountain town of Cedar Falls. The storm had been merciless that December night in 2003. 8-year-old Emma and Lily Hartwell had been sledding behind their family's cabin when the blizzard struck with an intensity that caught even the weathered mountain residents off guard. Their father, David Hartwell, had called them in for dinner at 6 o'clock, but by the time he reached the back door, the snow was falling so thick he couldn't see 5 feet ahead. The girls were gone. David Hartwell was a man who understood the mountains. He had grown up in Cedar Falls, knew every trail and ridge for miles around. He had taught his daughters to respect the wilderness, to stay close to home during storms, to never venture onto the ice of Copper Lake without permission. But 8-year-old girls could be unpredictable, and the storm had come faster than anyone. Expected. The search began immediately. David called his neighbors, the Hendersons, who lived a quarter-mile down the mountain road. Bill Henderson had been a park ranger for 30 years before his retirement, and he knew how to organize a search party. Within an hour, despite the worsening conditions, 12 men were combing the woods behind the Hartwell cabin, calling Emma and Lily's names into the howling wind. Sarah Hartwell stood at the kitchen window, her 10-year-old daughter Claire pressed against her side, both of them watching the flashlight beams dancing through the trees like lost stars. "They'll find them," Sarah whispered, though her voice shook with fear. "They have to find them." But the storm was unlike anything Cedar Falls had seen in decades. The National Weather Service would later call it a once-in-a-century blizzard, with wind speeds reaching 70 miles per hour and snowfall accumulating at a rate of 4 inches per hour. The temperature dropped to 20 below zero, and the wind chill made it feel like 50 below. By midnight, the search had to be called off. The men could barely see their own hands in front of their faces, and hypothermia was becoming a real threat. Sheriff Eugene Caldwell, Sheriff Reeves' predecessor, made the agonizing decision to suspend the search until dawn. "We'll start again. At first light," he promised David. "Every available man, woman, and child will be out there." But dawn brought no relief. The storm continued for 3 more days, dumping 6 feet of snow on the mountain and making travel impossible. When the weather finally cleared, the search resumed with a vengeance. The FBI was called in on the 4th day. Agent Rebecca Martinez, a specialist in missing children cases, arrived with a team of federal agents and sophisticated equipment. She interviewed the family, the neighbors, anyone who might have seen the girls before they vanished. "Tell me about their routine," Agent Martinez said, sitting across from David and Sarah at their kitchen table. "What did they like to do? Where did they play?" "They loved sledding," Sarah said, her voice hollow. "There's a hill behind the house, not too steep, perfectly safe. They'd been out there dozens of times. Any places they weren't supposed to." "Go?" David's jaw tightened. "Copper Lake. The ice can be thin in places, and the current underneath makes it dangerous." But they knew better. They wouldn't have gone there. Agent Martinez nodded. "What about other cabins in the area? Empty houses? Places they might have gone to seek shelter?" "The Henderson place," but Bill already checked. "The old Mackenzie cabin, up on Timber Ridge, but that's been abandoned for years. Jonas Mackenzie died back in '81, and his son Henry sealed it up tight. Said he never wanted to see the place again." The search expanded to include every structure within a 10-mile radius. Dogs were brought in from Denver, their handlers working around the clock to pick up any trace of the girls' scent. Helicopters from the National Guard flew grid patterns over the wilderness, their crews scanning the endless white landscape for any sign of life. Volunteers poured in from neighboring towns. The story of the missing twins had captured the attention of the regional news media, and soon families from across Colorado were making the drive to Cedar Falls to join the search. The town's small diner, Mabel's Place, became an unofficial headquarters, with searchers warming themselves over coffee and planning their next moves. Mabel Thompson, the diner's owner, had known the Hartwell family for years. She watched David grow thinner and more haggard with each passing day, saw the way Sarah's hands shook when she poured coffee, noticed how young Claire had stopped speaking entirely. "This is tearing that family apart," she confided to her cook, Tommy Rodriguez, who had been one of the first volunteers to join the search. David blames himself. You can see it in his eyes. Tommy nodded grimly. He had 3 daughters of his own, and he couldn't imagine the hell the Hartwells were going through. "We'll find them," he said, though he was beginning to have his doubts. "We have to." But as the days turned into weeks, hope began to fade. The dogs lost the scent trail in the endless snow. The helicopters found no trace of the girls. The FBI agents interviewed everyone in town, looking for any clue that might suggest the girls had been taken by someone, but Cedar Falls was a close-knit community where everyone knew everyone else's business. Father Michael Sullivan, the priest at St. Mary's Catholic Church, held special masses for the girls' safe return. The church was packed every night, with people from all faiths coming together to pray for a miracle. But as Christmas approached, the prayers began to sound more like farewells. Claire Hartwell, just 10 years old, became the forgotten victim of the tragedy. Her parents were consumed by grief and the desperate search for her sisters, and she was left to process her loss largely alone. She stopped attending school, stopped eating regular meals, stopped sleeping through the night. The family doctor, Dr. Patricia Yamamoto, was deeply concerned about the girl's psychological state. "She's showing signs of severe trauma," Dr. Yamamoto told Sarah privately. "She believes she's responsible for her sister's disappearance. She told me she should have gone sledding with them that day, that she could have prevented this somehow." Sarah's grief was mixed with guilt. She had been so focused on finding Emma and Lily that she had barely noticed her surviving daughter's pain. What can we do? She needs professional help, and she needs to know that her family is still intact, that she still has parents who love her and are present in her life. But David was beyond such advice. He spent every daylight hour in the mountains, searching long after the official search parties had given up. He would return home after dark, covered in snow and ice, eat a silent dinner, and then pore over maps and weather reports, trying to figure out where his daughters might have gone. The breaking point came on Christmas Eve. David had been gone. For 14 hours, searching a remote canyon that had already been covered by professional teams. When he finally returned home, he found Sarah packing suitcases. "Where are you going?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "We can't do this anymore, David. Look at us. Look at Claire. We're not helping Emma and Lily by destroying ourselves." "They're out there," David said desperately. "I know they're out there. I can feel it. They're dead, David." The words came out like a physical blow. "They died in the storm. They've been dead for weeks, and we need to accept that and start taking care of the daughter we still have." David looked at Claire, who was sitting on the living room floor, staring at the Christmas tree they had decorated weeks ago in happier times. The little girl looked like a ghost, pale and hollow-eyed. "I can't stop looking for them," he said quietly. "Then you'll be looking alone." Sarah took Claire to Portland to live with her sister, leaving David alone in the cabin with his grief and his obsession. The official search was called off on New Year's Day, 2004, after 6 weeks of the most intensive search effort in Colorado history. The FBI kept the case file open, but Agent Martinez was reassigned to other cases. The town of Cedar Falls slowly returned to normal, though the disappearance of the Hartwell twins remained a topic of hushed conversation. Theories abounded. The girls had fallen through the ice of Copper Lake. They had been taken by a mountain lion. They had been kidnapped by someone passing through town. But without bodies or evidence, the truth remained elusive. David Hartwell became a local legend, and not in a good way. He continued his solitary searches for years, becoming increasingly unstable and paranoid. He accused neighbors of hiding information, demanded that abandoned buildings be searched repeatedly, and eventually began to believe in conspiracy theories. About government cover-ups. In 2008, 5 years after the girl's disappearance, David was found dead in his cabin, apparently from a combination of alcohol and prescription medications. The coroner ruled it a suicide, though some in town whispered that it might have been accidental. Either way, the man who had loved his daughters more than life itself was finally at peace. Meanwhile, in Portland, Sarah was trying to rebuild her life with Claire. She found work as a nurse, enrolled Claire in a new school, and gradually began the process of healing. But the grief never fully left either of them. Claire grew up carrying the weight of her sister's disappearance. She excelled in school, as if trying to make up for the potential that Emma and Lily would never fulfill. She avoided making close friends, afraid of the questions about her family that might arise. She changed her name to Claire Hartwell Morrison when she married, as if trying to distance herself from the tragedy. In therapy, which she began in college, Claire explored her complex feelings about her sister's disappearance. The guilt was overwhelming. She had been invited to go sledding that day, but had chosen to stay inside and read instead. If she had gone with them, she reasoned, maybe they would have stayed closer to home. Maybe they would have come in when the storm started. Maybe they would still be alive. Survivor's guilt is common in these situations, her therapist, Dr. Lisa Chun, explained. But you need to understand that you were a child. You couldn't have prevented what happened, and you can't carry the responsibility for your sisters. Fate, but knowing something intellectually and feeling it emotionally were two different things. Claire carried the weight of her sister's disappearance into her marriage, into her career, into every decision she made. She became a forensic accountant, drawn to work that involved solving puzzles and uncovering hidden truths. She married Tom Morrison, a gentle man who understood her need for emotional space and never pushed her to talk about her past before she was ready. When Claire's first child was born, a daughter she named Grace, she experienced a panic attack so severe that she had to be hospitalized. The idea of being responsible for a child's safety, of potentially failing to protect her, as her parents had failed to protect Emma and Lily, was almost overwhelming. "I can't do this," she told Tom through tears. "What if something happens to her? What if I'm not careful enough?" Tom held her hand and spoke quietly. "You're not your parents, Claire. You're not responsible for what happened 20 years ago, and you're going to be a wonderful mother." It took months of therapy and medication, but Claire eventually found her footing as a mother. She had a second child, a son named James, and gradually learned to manage her anxiety about their safety. But she never fully let go of the questions about Emma and Lily. Every year, on December 12th, the anniversary of their disappearance, Claire would drive to Cedar Falls and visit their memorial in the town cemetery. The headstone read, "Emma and Lily Hartwell, forever in our hearts, 1995 to 2003. Though there were no bodies beneath it, she would sit there for hours, talking to her sisters as if they could hear her. She would tell them about her life, her marriage, her children. She would apologize for not being with them that day, for not saving them, for moving on with her life when they couldn't. The visits became a ritual, a way of maintaining a connection to the sisters she had lost. But they also kept the wound fresh, preventing her from fully healing. Then, in October 2023, Sheriff Janet Reeves called, Mrs. Morrison? This is Sheriff Reeves from Cedar Falls. I'm calling about your sisters, Emma and Lily Hartwell. We've found something." The words hit Claire like a physical blow. After 20 years, she had never expected to hear those words again. "What did you find?" "Names carved into the support beams of an abandoned cabin. Emma and Lily Hartwell, along with what appears to be a journal and some personal effects." Claire's legs gave out, and she sat down hard on her kitchen floor. Are you sure?" "I think you need to come down here, Mrs. Morrison. There's a lot we need to discuss." The drive from Seattle to Cedar Falls took 4 hours, but Claire's mind was racing faster than her car. 20 years of questions might finally have answers. 20 years of wondering if her sisters were still alive somewhere, if they had been taken by someone who loved them, if they might someday come home. Tom had wanted to come with her, but someone needed to stay with Grace and James. And truthfully, Claire needed to face this alone. This was something she had to do for Emma and Lily, and for herself. Cedar Falls looked different in the autumn light. The town had grown somewhat in the past 20 years, with new businesses and houses, but the essential character remained the same. The mountains still loomed over the valley, beautiful and mysterious, and somehow threatening. Sheriff Janet Reeves was waiting for her at the station, a weathered woman in her 50s who had been a young deputy during the original search. She remembered Claire as a traumatized 10-year-old, and her heart went out to the composed but fragile woman sitting across from her now. "Tell me about the cabin," Claire said without preamble. "The Mackenzie place, up on Timber Ridge. It's been abandoned since Jonas Mackenzie died back in '81. His son Henry sealed it up and never looked back. A developer was surveying the property for potential purchase when he found a way into the attic that had been hidden for decades." Sheriff Reeves pulled out a file folder thick with photographs and documents. The attic had been sealed off with a false panel, painted to match the ceiling. The developer only found it because he was looking for structural damage and noticed. The paint was a slightly different color. She showed Claire photographs of the narrow attic space, cramped and dark, with slanted roof lines that would have made it impossible for an adult to stand upright. In the center of the space, carved deep into a wooden support beam, were the names, Emma and Lily Hartwell. "There's more," Sheriff Reeves said gently. "We found a journal, wrapped in what appears to be a child's jacket, and other items. A stuffed animal, some food wrappers, evidence that someone had been living in that space." Claire's hands shook as she looked at the photographs. The jacket was pink with purple flowers, and she recognized it immediately. It had been Lily's favorite, the one she had been wearing the day she disappeared. "I need to see it," Claire said. "I need to go there." "I understand, but I want you to be prepared. This is likely going to be very difficult." Detective Marcus Webb, who had been working the case since the discovery, joined them for the drive to the Mackenzie cabin. He was a tall man with kind eyes who had children of his own, and he understood the delicate nature of the situation. "The cabin is in rough shape," he warned as they drove up the winding mountain road. 40 years of neglect have taken their toll, but the attic space is remarkably well preserved. The sealed environment protected it from the elements. The Mackenzie cabin sat on a ridge 3 miles from where the Hartwell family had lived, accessible only by a narrow dirt road that was barely visible through the overgrown brush. It was a modest structure, built from local timber in the 1940s, with a steep roof designed to shed snow and small windows that gave it an almost secretive appearance. Claire stood in the parking area, looking up at the cabin, and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. Her sisters had been here. After 20 years of wondering, of imagining them in a dozen different scenarios, they had been here, just 3 miles from home. "The family that lived here," she said. "Tell me about them." Detective Webb consulted his notes. Jonas Mackenzie built this place in 1947. He was a veteran, came back from the war with what we'd probably call PTSD today. He lived here alone for most of his life, kept to himself, rarely came into town. His son Henry visited occasionally, but they had a difficult relationship. What happened to him? According to the official records, he died in 1981, drowned in the river behind the cabin. His son found his clothes on the bank and assumed he'd fallen in. The body was never recovered, but that's not unusual in these mountain streams. The current is strong, and bodies can be carried miles downstream. They approached the cabin carefully, noting the way the wooden steps sagged under their weight and the windows that had been boarded up for decades. Inside, the air was thick, with dust and the smell of old wood and something else that made Claire's stomach turn. "The attic access is here," Detective Webb said, pointing to what appeared to be a solid ceiling panel above the main room. The developer found it completely by accident. He was checking for structural damage when he noticed this section of the ceiling was slightly different from the rest. Claire looked up at the hidden panel, imagining her 8-year-old sisters somehow finding their way into that cramped space. How would they have gotten up there? That's one of the questions we're trying to answer. There would have had to be a ladder or some way to reach the opening, and someone would have had to seal it back up afterward. Detective Webb set up a ladder and climbed into the attic space first, then helped Claire up. The space was even more cramped than the photographs had suggested, with roof lines so low that Claire had to crawl on her hands and knees. The flashlight beam illuminated the carved names, and Claire gasped. The letters were deep and carefully formed, not the hasty scratches of frightened children, but the deliberate work of someone who wanted to leave a permanent record. "We were here," she read aloud, noting the smaller letters carved below the names. "There's more," Detective Webb said, directing his light to a corner where a collection of items had been carefully arranged. The pink jacket was there, along with a small leather journal, a stuffed rabbit that Claire recognized as Emma's favorite toy, and several food wrappers that appeared to be from the early 2000s. Claire reached for the journal with trembling hands. It was water-damaged and brittle, but readable. The cover was decorated with stickers of butterflies and flowers, typical of something an 8-year-old girl would choose. "We photographed every page before we moved anything," Detective Webb said, "but we wanted you to see the original." The first entry was dated December 15th, 2003, 3 days after the girls had vanished. The handwriting was Lily's, careful and round in the way of a child who was still learning to write in cursive. "We got lost in the storm. Emma hurt her foot and couldn't walk good. We found this place and climbed up here where it's warm. The nice man said we could stay until the storm stops. He brought us food and blankets and said he would take us home when the snow melts." Claire felt the world tilt around her. A man, someone had found her sisters during the storm, had brought them to this cabin, had helped them. But who? And why hadn't he taken them home? "Keep reading," Detective Webb said gently. The entries continued, chronicling days that stretched into weeks. The mysterious man visited regularly, bringing food and water, telling the girls stories, playing simple games with them. He assured them that their parents were looking for them, but that the snow was too deep, the roads too dangerous for travel. December 20th. The man brought us hot soup today and more blankets. He said Daddy is looking for us, but the snow is too deep. He promised to take us home for Christmas. Emma's foot is better, but she still limps. We miss Mommy and Daddy and Claire so much. Claire's tears fell onto the brittle pages as she read. Her sisters had been alive, had been taken care of, had believed they were going home. What had gone wrong? December 25th. It's Christmas today. The man brought us presents, coloring books and crayons and some candy. He said Daddy is still looking, but the storm is too bad. He promised after New Year's. We sang Christmas songs, and Emma told the story about baby Jesus. I miss Christmas at home. The entries became more sporadic after that, and the tone began to change. The man's visits became less frequent. The food supplies dwindled. The girls grew scared, cold, hungry. January 2nd. The man hasn't come in 3 days. We're getting hungry, and the water is almost gone. Emma found some old cans in the corner, but we can't open them. We can hear people calling our names sometimes, but they sound far away. Claire's hands shook as she turned the pages. Her sisters had been so close to rescue, had actually heard the search parties calling for them. Why hadn't they called back? Why hadn't they tried to escape? January 5th. Emma tried to get down from the attic, but she couldn't reach the floor. The man must have taken a ladder. We yelled as loud as we could, but nobody came. Emma is getting sick. She has a bad cough, and her face is hot. The realization hit Claire like a physical blow. The man hadn't just abandoned her sisters. He had trapped them in the attic, taking away their means of escape. January 8th. The man hasn't come. In 6 days, Emma is very sick. She won't eat, and she sleeps all the time. I'm scared. I carved our names in the wood, so Daddy will know we were here if he finds us. Detective Webb watched Claire's face as she read, seeing the progression from hope to horror to devastating grief. This was the hardest part of his job, watching families confront the reality of their loss. January 12th. Emma is worse. She can't wake up, and her breathing sounds funny. I gave her all the water, but she won't drink. I'm so scared. Why hasn't the man come back? Why can't we get down? The entries became increasingly desperate, the handwriting shakier, as Lily's condition deteriorated alongside her sisters. January 15th. Emma died this morning. She just stopped breathing. I don't know what to do. I covered her with the blankets like Mommy does when we're sleeping. I'm going to try to break the floorboards and get down. I have to get help. I have to go home. Claire couldn't continue reading. She set the journal down and sobbed, her cries echoing in the cramped attic space. For 20 years, she had imagined her sister's fate, but the reality was worse than anything. She had conceived. Detective Webb climbed down from the attic and waited for Claire to compose herself. When she finally descended, her face was streaked with tears and her hands were shaking. There's more, she said quietly. What happened to Lily? The final entry is dated January 18th, Detective Webb said. She wrote that she was going to try to find a way home. She apologized to your father and said she loved all of you. Did she ... We found her remains in the attic, along with Emma's. She never made it out. The crime scene team arrived while Claire was still processing the initial shock. The cabin was cordoned off with yellow tape, and investigators began the painstaking process of documenting every inch of the attic space. Dr. Sandra Kim, the county coroner, examined the scene with the careful attention of someone who understood the importance of getting every detail right. The remains were carefully removed and transported to the morgue, where they would undergo extensive analysis. Based on the condition of the remains and the evidence in the journal, Dr. Kim explained to Claire later, it appears that Emma died of pneumonia, likely brought on by exposure and malnutrition. Lily survived several days longer before succumbing to hypothermia and dehydration. The knowledge that her sisters had died slowly, frightened and alone, was almost more than Claire could bear. But there were still unanswered questions. Who was the man who had found them? Why had he abandoned them? And how had he managed to seal them in the attic? Sheriff Reeves assembled a team of investigators to reopen the case. The FBI was contacted, and Agent Rebecca Martinez, now retired but still living in Denver, agreed to consult on the investigation. I remember this case, Agent Martinez said when she arrived in Cedar Falls. It haunted me for years. I always believed those girls were still alive somewhere. The investigation focused on identifying the mysterious man mentioned in Lily's journal. The description was vague. Nice man who knew their father and promised to take them home. But it was a starting point. We need to look at everyone who lived in the area in 2003, Agent Martinez said. Anyone who would have had access to the Mackenzie cabin. Anyone who might have been in the mountains during the storm. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Margaret Penfield, now in her 70s, had been the town librarian for 40 years. She had been following the news coverage of the discovery when something in the journal entries triggered a memory. I need to speak with Sheriff Reeves, she told her daughter over the phone. It's about the Hartwell girls. I think I know who the man was. Margaret met with the investigators the next day, her weathered hands shaking as she spoke. It was Jonas Mackenzie. He didn't die in 1981. He disappeared. The room fell silent. According to all official records, Jonas Mackenzie had drowned in the river behind his cabin in 1981. Tell us what you know, Agent Martinez said gently. Margaret took a deep breath. Jonas was my cousin. We weren't close, but family is family. He'd been struggling with mental illness for years, what we'd call PTSD now, but back then, we just said he was shell-shocked from the war. He'd been in and out of psychiatric hospitals since the 1960s. She paused, gathering her thoughts. Henry was ashamed of his father's condition. This was a small town, and mental illness carried a stigma. When Jonas disappeared in 1981, Henry found his clothes by the river and assumed he'd drowned. But they never found a body. You think he was still alive? I think Henry wanted everyone to believe he was dead. It was easier than admitting his father had run off into the mountains, that he was living wild up there, that he was getting worse. Agent Martinez leaned forward. Did you ever see Jonas after 1981? Margaret nodded reluctantly. A few times. Over the years. Usually in winter, when food would be scarce. He'd come to my back door, thin and wild-looking, asking for supplies. I'd give him what I could, but I was scared of him. He wasn't the same man I'd known as a child. Why didn't you report this? Because he was family. Because he was sick. Not dangerous. Because I thought if I helped him, maybe he'd get better on his own. Margaret's voice broke. I never imagined he would hurt children. The search for Jonas Mackenzie began immediately. If he was still alive, he would be 87 years old and unlikely to be living rough in the mountains. The investigators began checking nursing homes, psychiatric facilities, and homeless shelters throughout the region. They found him 3 days later in a long-term care facility in Spokane, Washington, registered under the name John Mitchell. He had been a resident there for 15 years, suffering from advanced dementia and unable to care for himself. Claire made the trip to Spokane with Detective Webb and Agent Martinez, her stomach churning at the thought of confronting the man who had killed her sisters. She had imagined this moment for years, had dreamed of confronting the person responsible for destroying her family. But the man they found in the nursing home was nothing like her imagined monster. Jonas Mackenzie was small and frail, with wild, white hair and eyes that seemed to look through the world rather than at it. He sat in a wheelchair by the window, staring out at the parking lot with no apparent awareness of his surroundings. Mr. Mackenzie, Agent Martinez said gently, sitting down beside him. We'd like to ask you some questions. Jonas's eyes slowly focused on her face, and for a moment there was a flicker of recognition. Are you the nurse? He asked in a voice barely above a whisper. No, Mr. Mackenzie. I'm Agent Martinez with the FBI. We're here to ask you about Emma and Lily Hartwell. At the mention of the girls' names, Jonas's entire demeanor changed. His eyes brightened, and a smile spread across his weathered face. "Sweet girls," he said. "They were so cold, so scared. I helped them. I brought them food." Claire felt her heart pounding. After 20 years, she was finally face to face with Dai, the man who had destroyed her family. "Where did you take them, Jonas?" Detective Webb asked. "To my cabin. They were lost in the storm, crying for their daddy. I told them I'd take them home when the snow stopped." "But you didn't take them home," Claire said, her voice barely controlled. "You left them there to die." Jonas looked confused, his smile fading. "I couldn't leave. My son was looking for me. He wanted to put me away again. I had to hide." Over the course of several interviews, the full picture emerged. Jonas had been living wild in the mountains since 1981, hiding from his son's attempts to have him institutionalized. He had survived by raiding abandoned cabins, stealing from campsites, and occasionally begging for food from sympathetic residents like Margaret Penfield. His mental illness had worsened over the years, and by 2003, he was experiencing severe paranoid delusions. When he found Emma and Lily during the storm, his damaged mind convinced him that he was rescuing them, that he was a hero saving children from certain death. "I brought them to my cabin," he told the investigators. "It was warm there, safe. I gave them food and blankets. I told them stories about the war, about their daddy. I knew David when he was a boy. Why didn't you take them home when the storm ended?" Jonas's face crumpled with confusion. "I was going to. But then I heard the helicopters, the dogs. I thought they were looking for me. I thought my son had sent them to take me away." His paranoia had convinced him that the massive search effort was actually focused on finding him, not the girls. Rather than risk capture, he had fled deeper into the mountains, leaving Emma and Lily trapped in the attic of his cabin. "I was going to go back," he insisted. "I was going to take them home, but I couldn't. I was too scared." The investigators learned that Jonas had sealed the attic entrance to prevent the girls from escaping and potentially revealing his hiding place. In his delusional state, he believed he was protecting them from the dangerous people who were looking for him. "Did you know they died?" Claire asked, her voice breaking. Jonas stared at her for a long moment, his eyes filling with tears. "I knew," he whispered. "I went back in the spring, when the snow melted. I found them. I covered them up nice, like they were sleeping. I said a prayer. Why didn't you report it? Why didn't you tell someone? Because then everyone would know what I'd done. Because my son would put me away forever. Because I was scared." He had lived with the guilt for 20 years, his dementia, providing only intermittent relief from the knowledge of what he had done. The nursing home staff said he often talked about the girls in his sleep, sometimes crying out their names. "He's been like this for years," said Dr. Patricia Henley, the facility's director. "He has moments of clarity, but most of the time, he's lost in his own mind. He talks about children he says he failed to save." Jonas Mackenzie died 2 weeks after the interview, passing away quietly in his sleep. His death certificate listed the cause as pneumonia, but those who knew the full story suspected he had simply given up, finally succumbing to the weight of his guilt. The investigation officially closed on Christmas Eve, 2023, exactly 20 years and 12 days after Emma and Lily Hartwell vanished into the storm. The case file was thick with evidence, witness statements, and forensic reports, but the questions that had haunted Claire for 2 decades finally had answers. The coroner's report provided additional details that were both heartbreaking and illuminating. Emma had died of pneumonia, her small body unable to fight off the infection in the cold, unsanitary conditions of the attic. Lily had survived for several more days, but had ultimately succumbed to hypothermia and dehydration. They were together. Dr. Kim told Claire gently. Lily wrapped Emma in blankets and held her until the end. They weren't alone. The funeral was held on a cold January day, with nearly the entire town of Cedar Falls in attendance. The girls' remains were laid to rest in the cemetery beside their father, under a headstone that read, "Emma and Lily Hartwell, beloved daughters and sisters, together forever." Claire spoke at the service, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "Emma and Lily were taken from us too soon, but they were never forgotten. Not by our family, not by this community, and not by the man who spent his final years haunted by what he had done." She held up Lily's journal, which had been returned to her after the investigation concluded. "In these pages, they tell their story. They tell us they loved us, that they weren't angry, that they understood we were looking for them. They tell us they were together, and that in the end, they weren't alone." The memorial service was followed by a reception at the town hall, where people shared memories of the girls and the impact their disappearance had had on the community. Many of the original searchers were there, now gray-haired and weathered, but still carrying the weight of the children they couldn't save. Bill Henderson, now in his 80s, approached Claire with tears in his eyes. "I'm sorry we couldn't find them," he said simply. "I'm sorry we failed them." "You didn't fail them," Claire replied. "You searched for them when no one else would have. You gave them hope, even when they couldn't see you. That matters." After the service, Claire walked up to the Mackenzie cabin one final time. The developer had withdrawn his purchase offer, and the town council had voted to preserve the site as a memorial. A small plaque would be installed, reading, "In memory of Emma and Lily Hartwell. May their story never be forgotten." She stood in the attic, where her sisters had spent their final weeks, running her fingers over the carved names in the beam. The space had been cleaned and sanitized, but she could still feel the presence of the two little girls who had waited so patiently for rescue that never came. "I found you," she whispered to the empty air. "I finally found you." On the wall beside the names, someone had left a new carving, "Forever in our hearts, the town of Cedar Falls." Claire never found out who had done it, but she suspected it was one of the original searchers, someone who had never stopped believing that someday, somehow, the truth would come to light. As she prepared to leave Cedar Falls for what she knew would be the last time, Claire reflected on the strange journey that had brought her here. For 20 years, she had lived with unanswered questions, with guilt and grief that had shaped every aspect of her life. Now, finally, she had the truth. But the truth was more complicated than she had expected. Jonas Mackenzie was not the monster she had imagined. He was a broken man, damaged by war and illness, who had genuinely believed he was helping her sisters. His actions had been wrong, criminally wrong, but they had come from a place of confusion and fear rather than malice. That knowledge didn't make the loss any easier to bear, but it did provide a different kind of closure. Emma and Lily had not died at the hands of a predator who had hunted them. They had died because a sick man had made a series of terrible decisions, each one building on the last until tragedy became inevitable. Claire drove away from Cedar Falls with a heavy heart, but also with a sense of peace she hadn't felt in decades. The questions that had haunted her for 20 years finally had answers. The sisters she had lost were finally at rest, and she could begin the process of truly healing. The story of Emma and Lily Hartwell's disappearance had one more chapter to unfold. In the months following the discovery, several other families came forward with their own stories of missing children in the area. The FBI reopened investigations into 3 other cases from the 1980s and 1990s, looking for possible connections to Jonas Mackenzie. One of those cases involved a 7-year-old boy named Timothy Chun, who had vanished during a camping trip in 1987. His family had always suspected he had been abducted, but the discovery of Jonas's long presence in the mountains raised new questions. Agent Martinez, though officially retired, found herself drawn back into the work. "It's possible that Jonas was involved in other disappearances," she told the investigative team. "His mental state was deteriorating over decades. There's no way to know what else he might have done." The investigation into Timothy Chun's disappearance led to a search of several other abandoned structures in the area, places where Jonas might have taken children he encountered in the woods. In an old mining shack 12 miles from the Mackenzie cabin, investigators found evidence that someone had been living there intermittently for years. Among the debris, they discovered a child's shoe that matched the description of what Timothy had been wearing when he vanished. DNA analysis confirmed that the shoe had belonged to the missing boy, but no other remains were found. The Timothy Chun case remained officially unsolved, but his family finally had some answers. "At least we know he didn't suffer alone," his mother, Linda Chun, said through tears. "At least we know someone found him, even if that someone was sick and couldn't help him properly." Claire followed these developments from her home in Seattle, feeling a complex mix of emotions. Part of her was relieved that other families might find closure, but another part of her was horrified by the possibility that Jonas Mackenzie had been responsible for multiple tragedies over the decades. She began corresponding with Linda Chun and the families of other missing children, forming an unlikely support network of people who had lived through similar tragedies. Together, they advocated for better search protocols, improved mental health services in rural areas, and more comprehensive tracking of missing persons cases. "We can't bring our children back," Claire said at a conference on missing children 6 months after the discovery. "But we can work to prevent other families from experiencing what we've been through." The work gave her a sense of purpose, a way to honor her sister's memory while helping others. She established the Emma and Lily Hartwell Foundation, which provided funding for search and rescue operations and supported families of missing children. But perhaps the most important outcome of the discovery was the effect it had on Claire's own family. For the first time in 20 years, she was able to talk openly with her children about their aunts, to share stories and memories without the weight of unanswered questions. "Aunt Emma loved butterflies," she told her daughter Grace one evening, showing her pictures from the family album. "She used to catch them in the garden and then let them go, because she said they were too beautiful to keep in cages. And Aunt Lily liked to read," she continued, turning the page. "She was always asking me to read her stories before bed. She said she wanted to be a teacher when she grew up, so she could read stories to other kids." Grace, now 12 years old, listened with rapt attention. She had known about her missing aunts, but her mother had never been able to talk about them in detail before. "Do you think they would have liked me?" she asked. Claire's eyes filled with tears. "They would have loved you," she said. "They would have loved you so much." Tom watched these conversations with a mixture of sadness and relief. For their entire marriage, he had seen his wife carry the weight of her sister's disappearance, the way it affected her relationships, her parenting, her ability to trust in the safety of the world. Now, finally, she seemed to be finding peace. "You're different," he told her one night as they lay in bed. "Lighter, somehow. I feel like I can breathe again," Claire said. "Like I've been holding my breath for 20 years, and I can finally let it out." The healing process wasn't immediate or complete. Claire still had nightmares about the attic, still felt waves of grief when she thought about her sister's final days. But the crushing weight of not knowing, the endless questions and possibilities, had been lifted. She began seeing Dr. Chon again, working through the complex emotions surrounding the discovery. "Grief is not linear," her therapist reminded her. "You're not just grieving their deaths now. You're grieving the lost years, the relationship you never got to have with them as adults, the children they never got to have." "But I'm also grateful," Claire said. "Grateful to finally know what happened. Grateful that they were together, grateful that they knew we were looking for them. The journal entries had provided that small comfort. In her final writings, Lily had expressed not anger or resentment, but love and understanding. She had forgiven her parents for not finding them, had sent messages of love to Claire, had faced her death with a maturity that was heartbreaking in its innocence. One entry in particular had given Claire peace. I know Mommy and Daddy and Claire are looking for us. I can hear them calling our names. Even if we can't call back, I want them to know we hear them. We know they love us. We love them too. As the first anniversary of the discovery approached, Claire found herself returning to Cedar Falls once more. The memorial plaque had been installed at the Mackenzie cabin, and a small garden had been planted nearby, filled with butterflies and flowers that would bloom in memory of Emma and Lily. She wasn't the only one who had come to pay respects. Many of the original searchers were there, along with family members of other missing children and townspeople who had been touched by the story. It had become an annual gathering, a way for the community to remember and honor not just Emma and Lily, but all the children who had been lost. Margaret Penfield, now in her 80s, approached Claire with tears in her eyes. I should have spoken up sooner, she said. I should have told someone Jonas was still alive. You couldn't have known, Claire replied, taking the older woman's hands. You were kind to him when he needed help. You can't blame yourself for what happened. But maybe if I had, maybe a lot of things, Claire interrupted gently. Maybe if the storm hadn't been so severe, maybe if my sisters had stayed inside that day, maybe if my father had called them in 5 minutes earlier. We can't live in the maybes, Mrs. Penfield. We have to live in the now. It was a lesson Claire had learned painfully over the past year. The discovery of her sister's fate had answered the questions of what and how, but it had also raised new questions about responsibility, about the nature of evil, about the randomness of tragedy. Jonas Mackenzie had not been a monster in the traditional sense. He had been a damaged man whose illness had led him to make catastrophic decisions. That knowledge didn't excuse his actions, but it did complicate the narrative of good versus evil that Claire had carried for 20 years. I hated him for so long, she told Tom one evening. I imagined him as this evil person who had deliberately hurt my sisters. But the truth is more complicated than that. Does that make it easier or harder? Tom asked. Both, Claire said. It's easier because I don't have to carry that hate anymore. But it's harder because it means bad things can happen for no good reason. Because people who aren't evil can still do terrible things. The complexity of these emotions was something she continued to work through with Dr. Chun. Forgiveness doesn't mean excusing what he did, her therapist explained. It means releasing yourself from the burden of anger and hate. I'm not sure I can forgive him, Claire said, but I think I can understand him, and maybe that's enough. As the years passed, Claire found herself becoming something of an expert on missing children cases. She consulted with law enforcement agencies, spoke at conferences, and worked with families who were facing their own tragedies. The Emma and Lily Hartwell Foundation grew into a national organization that funded search efforts and provided support, services. But perhaps more importantly, Claire was able to be fully present for her own family in a way she had never been before. She coached Grace's soccer team, helped James with his science projects, and traveled with Tom to places she had never felt free to explore before. You're a different person, her mother, Sarah, told her during one of their regular phone calls. Sarah had remarried and was living in Arizona now, but she and Claire had rebuilt their relationship slowly over the years. I feel like I'm the person I was supposed to be, Claire said. Before everything happened, I was just a normal kid. Now, I feel like I can be a normal adult. What do you think Emma and Lily would think of who you've become? Claire considered the question. I think they'd be proud. I think they'd be happy that I didn't let their deaths destroy me completely. I think they'd want me to live. On the 5th anniversary of the discovery, Claire published a book about her family's experience. Finding Emma and Lily, a sister's journey through loss and healing, became a bestseller, with proceeds going to the foundation. The book was both a memoir and a meditation on grief, loss, and the importance of never giving up hope. I wrote this book not just for my sisters, Claire said in interviews, but for all the families who are still searching, still hoping, still believing that someday they'll have answers. The truth doesn't always set you free, but it does give you the foundation to build a new kind of life. The book's success led to speaking engagements across the country, and Claire found herself becoming an advocate for missing children and their families. She testified before Congress about the need for better coordination between law enforcement agencies, and she worked with technology companies to develop new tools for search and rescue operations. But she never forgot where it all began. Every year, on December 12th, she returned to Cedar Falls to visit the memorial garden at the Mackenzie cabin. She would sit quietly among the flowers, talking to her sisters as if they were still 8 years old, telling them about her life, her children, her work. I kept my promise, she would tell them. I never stopped looking for you. And now I'm helping other people find their children too. The garden had grown over the years, tended by volunteers from the community. There were butterfly bushes and wildflowers, a small bench where visitors could sit and reflect, and a stone pathway that led to the memorial plaque. It had become a place of pilgrimage for families of missing children, a symbol of hope and remembrance. On one of these visits, Claire was surprised to find a young woman sitting on the bench, crying softly. The woman looked to be in her 20s, with dark hair and eyes that held a familiar pain. "I'm sorry," the woman said, starting to leave. "I didn't mean to intrude." "You're not intruding," Claire said gently. "Are you here about someone you lost?" The woman nodded, tears streaming down her face. "My brother. He disappeared when we were kids. I heard about this place, about your sisters, and I thought maybe if I came here, I might find some peace." Claire sat down beside her. "What was his name?" "Michael. Michael Rodriguez. He was 6 when he vanished. That was 15 years ago." Claire felt a chill of recognition. "Rodriguez. Is your family from around here?" "My father was. Tommy Rodriguez. He used to work at the diner in town." Claire remembered Tommy from the early days of the search for her sisters. He had been one of the most dedicated volunteers, searching day and night despite having a family of his own to worry about. "Your father helped look for Emma and Lily," Claire said softly. "He was one of the good ones." The woman's eyes widened. "You're Claire Hartwell. I mean, Claire Morrison. I recognize you from the book." "Yes, and you're Michael's sister, Sophia." "Sophia Rodriguez Martinez." They talked for an hour, sharing their stories, their grief, their struggles with unanswered questions. Sophia's brother had disappeared from their backyard while playing, much like Emma and Lily had vanished while sledding. The search had been thorough but unsuccessful, and the family had never found any trace of him. "I keep thinking about what you wrote in your book," Sophia said, "about how the not knowing was almost worse than knowing the truth. I understand that now." "Have you considered having the case reopened?" Claire asked. "There are new techniques now, new resources that weren't available 15 years ago." Sophia shook her head. "My parents can't handle it. My father blamed himself for years. He died of a heart attack 5 years ago, and my mother says it was from a broken heart. She doesn't want to go through it all again." Claire understood. The process of reopening a missing child case was painful and traumatic, even when it led to answers. Not every family was ready for that journey. "If you ever change your mind," Claire said, handing Sophia her business card. "The foundation can help. We have resources, connections, people who understand what you're going through." They parted with a long embrace, two women bound by the shared experience of loss and the hope for answers. Claire drove home thinking about the ripple effects of tragedy, how one family's loss could echo through generations and communities. Month later, Sophia called. "I want to reopen Michael's case," she said. "My mother is finally ready. She says she needs to know, one way or another." The investigation into Michael Rodriguez's disappearance became the Foundation's most complex case. Unlike Emma and Lily, who had vanished during a specific storm event, Michael had simply been there one moment and gone the next. There were no witnesses, no clear timeline, no obvious suspects, but the new investigation benefited from advances in technology and investigative techniques that hadn't been available in 2008. DNA analysis, cell phone data, social media records, and improved database searches all provided new avenues for investigation. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A routine review of sex offender registries revealed that a man named Robert Kellerman had been living in Cedar Falls in 2008, working as a traveling salesman. He had been arrested in 2015 for child abduction in another state, and his vehicle and personal effects had been thoroughly searched. Among the items found in his possession was a child's toy truck that matched the description of one Michael Rodriguez had been playing with the day he disappeared. DNA testing confirmed that the truck had belonged to Michael, providing the first concrete evidence of what had happened to him. Kellerman was already serving a life sentence for his other crimes, but the discovery of Michael's toy provided closure for his family. Under questioning, he admitted to abducting Michael, but claimed the boy had died accidentally during transport. He led investigators to a remote location where Michael's remains were found. The news was devastating for the Rodriguez family, but it also brought the closure they had been seeking for 15 years. Michael was laid to rest in a ceremony attended by hundreds of people, including many of the same volunteers who had searched for Emma and Lily. "At least we know," Sophia said through her tears. "At least we can stop wondering." Claire spoke at Michael's funeral, drawing parallels between the two cases and the importance of never giving up hope. "The truth is not always what we want to hear," she said, "but it is what we need to find peace." The Michael Rodriguez case became a model for how cold cases could be reopened and solved using modern techniques. The Foundation used it as an example when lobbying for increased funding for missing children investigations and when training law enforcement personnel on new investigative methods. But for Claire, the case was also a reminder of why her work mattered. Every family deserved answers, every child deserved to be found, and every tragedy deserved to be met with determination and hope. As she entered her 40s, Claire found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this point. She had been shaped by tragedy, but she had not been defined by it. She had taken the worst experience of her life and transformed it into a force for good. Her children, now teenagers, were proud of their mother's work and understood the importance of what she did. Grace had expressed interest in studying criminal justice, inspired by her mother's example. James was more interested in technology and had already begun developing apps that could help with search and rescue operations. "You've raised them well," Tom told her one evening as they watched their children work on their homework. "They understand that tragedy doesn't have to be the end of the story. They understand that love doesn't end with death," Claire replied. "That's the most important lesson I can teach them." On the 10th anniversary of the discovery, Claire stood once again in the memorial garden at the Mackenzie cabin. The space had evolved into something beautiful and peaceful, a place where families could come to remember their lost children and find comfort in community. The butterfly bushes were in full bloom, their purple and white flowers attracting clouds of monarchs and swallowtails. Emma would have loved it, Claire thought. She would have spent hours here, watching the butterflies dance from flower to flower. A new addition to the garden caught her eye. A small bronze plaque that read, "In memory of all the children who are still missing, and in honor of the families who never stop searching." Beside it was a bench where visitors could sit and reflect. On the bench was a book where people could write messages to their lost loved ones. Claire opened it and found hundreds of entries from families across the country, all sharing their stories of loss and hope. She added her own message. To Emma and Lily, you are loved every day you are missing, and you are loved every day still. Your story has helped other families find their children, and your memory continues to inspire people to never give up hope. Thank you for teaching me that love transcends death, and that the bonds of family are stronger than time or distance. Until we meet again, I will carry you in my heart. Love always, Claire. As she closed the book, Claire felt a sense of completion. The journey that had begun with tragedy had led to healing, understanding, and a life dedicated to helping others. Emma and Lily's story would continue to ripple outward, touching other families, inspiring other searches, and reminding the world that every child matters. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. Claire stood for a moment longer, feeling the presence of her sisters in the gentle breeze that rustled through the butterfly bushes. Then she walked back to her car, ready to return to her family, her work, and the life she had built from the ashes of loss. The twin sisters who had vanished during a snowstorm 20 years earlier had finally found their way home. Not in the way anyone had hoped, but in the way that mattered most, in the hearts of those who loved them, in the lives they had touched, and in the legacy of love and determination they had left behind. Their names, carved into the wooden beam of a sealed cabin attic, had unlocked not just the mystery of their disappearance, but the power of truth to heal, love to endure, and hope to transcend even the darkest of tragedies. Emma and Lily Hartwell were no longer missing. They were found, remembered, and forever loved.